This is what can be seen of Ravensbrück concentration camp today. Neat, well-ordered buildings which have been preserved, and a large area where barracks once stood, but have, in the aftermath of World War II, been removed. At the end of World War II, a number of trials were held against the National Socialist criminals, where one of the charges was crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is defined as a criminal act or acts which are committed by or on behalf of a de facto authority that grossly violate human rights as part of a government policy or are tolerated by that government. Such crimes against humanity include the likes of forced medical experiments, and such experiments carried out by Herta Oberheuser are the subject of this presentation. Herta Oberheuser was born here in Cologne on the 15th of May 1911. Her father was an engineer. She grew up slightly further north in Düsseldorf, where she graduated from high school in 1931. She then studied medicine in Bonn and Düsseldorf. The Oberheuser family was wealthy enough to be able to consider sending their daughter to university, but not wealthy enough to completely pay for it. So Oberheuser had to partially finance her studies herself by working through university. She was fortunate enough to start her studies at a time when the education of women was still encouraged. Nonetheless, she was able to continue her studies through the initial period of National Socialist rule and passed her state examination in 1936 and received her doctorate the following year. Her first job was as an assistant doctor at the Physiological Institute in Bonn. Then she worked at a medical clinic in Düsseldorf. She then decided to undergo specialist training as a dermatologist and moved to the Düsseldorf Dermatology Clinic. She received her specialist title in dermatology in 1940, a large part of which used experiments on live animals and vivisection. From that year, she worked at the health department in Düsseldorf. During the National Socialist era, communal activities were encouraged, if not virtually obligatory. The point of this was to create a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community. The idea behind it is to subvert the will of the individual to that of the mass, which in turn is controlled by the people at the top. It is exactly the same methodology in communism, which is why I think it's a mistake to consider that fascism and communism are opposite poles of the spectrum. They are not. Herta Oberheuser joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, the National Association of German Girls, in 1935, where she became a community doctor who was also supposed to teach basic medical skills. In 1937 she became a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and later also of the National Socialist Nursing Sisters Association, the Nazi Medical Association and the Nazi Air Raid Defense Association. Concentration camps advertised for staff in the press, as any other organisation would do. However, they did not state precisely what they did, nor who the employer was. Usually the applicant would only find out what the job was on arrival at the camp. There are cases from Ravensbruck, for example, where the applicant was informed and then given a chance to think about it. If the applicant did not want to go ahead, then a return ticket might be issued, or if the prospective employer was feeling spiteful, the applicant might have to pay for his or her own way back. As an aside, I see this channel not only as a history site, but also I want to encourage people to actually visit places, and that's why I show videos of the places where these events actually took place. The Ravensbrück Museum has a very interesting exhibition on staff recruitment, something I think that many of us really don't often consider when dealing with subjects related to the National Socialist era. In 1940, a job advertisement was placed in a medical magazine for the position as a camp doctor in a women's retraining camp. Herta Oberheuser applied and was given 3 months training and then drafted into service at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. As from the beginning of 1941, she worked there and reported to site doctors Walter Sonntag and Gerhard Szydlowski. In May 1942, elements of the Czech resistance were parachuted into that country from the United Kingdom with the aim of assassinating the Nazi protector, Reinhard Heydrich. The initial attempt failed to kill him, and Heydrich was rushed off to hospital. His health improved and he even started to eat solid foods, very soon after major stomach surgery, which I understand is not a good idea. However, he relapsed and died. Karl Gebhardt, a protege of Himmler, had been sent to Prague to assess him. Gebhardt had refused to administer sulfonamides, which was then one of the standard procedures to help those who had injuries similar to those of Heydrich. Hitler's personal physician, Theodor Morell, had a factory which produced sulfonamides and was thus keen to promote their use. Speer wrote inside the Third Reich that Hitler had told him that they were a miracle cure. A dispute erupted between the two, which Karl Gebhardt decided to settle by proving that they would not have saved the life of Heydrich. Gebhardt was based at the clinic at Hohenlychen, which you can see in this video. Hohenlychen is very close to Ravensbruck, and so Gebhardt chose to perform pseudo-experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Ravensbruck. In this case, it needs to be remembered that Gebhardt already knew what he wanted to prove, that he was not responsible for the death of Heydrich. Bacteria, putrefactive pathogens, wood splinters and glass were placed in specially inflicted wounds on the victims of the experiments, imitating injuries caused by bomb splinters. The course of the wound and the effect on the tested medications were documented and analysed. Many victims died during these experiments, others died years later from the consequences of them. Karl Gebhardt was assisted by Fritz Fischer, Ludwig Stumpfegger and Herta Oberheuser. It would seem that Fischer and Stumpfegger were unable to stomach the experiment, so over time Oberheuser gradually took on more and more of her colleagues' functions, thereby ensuring that the experiments were carried out to the satisfaction of Gebhardt. Their tasks including selecting the female prisoners for the experiments, assisting during the operations and ensuring the follow-up, which could be care to allow the prisoner to get better or targeted non-care to encourage a deterioration of the healing process in order to study what happened. She primarily selected young Polish women who were imprisoned in the concentration camp for political reasons. After the experiments were concluded, many of the women were murdered by Oberheuser through injections, which she later tried to portray as a humanitarian act. Unlike her colleagues, who also deliberately killed patients with injections, Oberheuser chose gasoline injections, which only took effect after 3 to 5 minutes and when the test victims were fully conscious. Oberheuser's statements clearly showed her attitude towards the patients, whom she perceived as guinea pigs and not as people. Other medical experiments in Ravensbrück were mostly aimed at researching what happened to the body under extreme conditions, for example in cold weather, often with a view to military use to treat frostbite or injuries that soldiers might suffer in combat. The appropriate injuries were inflicted on the test subjects and statistics were compiled and remedies were experimented with. Oberheuser was not only involved in medical experiments but also in forced abortions and other medical procedures. These were carried out on women who were already 7 or 8 months pregnant. In this case, Oberheuser was frequently acting independently. No one was ordering her to do this. In addition to abortion through medical intervention, there were also abortions through beatings and the killing of newborns. Herta Oberheuser was responsible for at least 60 murders while she was at Ravensbrück. Unlike her male colleagues, Oberheuser did not use the results of her experiments at the Ravensbrück concentration camp for her future career after the end of the war. She saw her task as supporting her male superiors, but in doing so she contributed significantly to the realization of the human experiments. In the autumn of 1943 she moved to work with Karl Gebhardt as surgical assistant here at the Hohenlychen sanatorium. She was appointed to the position of assistant physician to SS Dr. Karl Gebhardt. Here, the two continued to carry out experiments on humans. Whilst at Hohenlychen, she also worked with Dr. Enno Lolling, the Chief of Office 3D, the man responsible for all doctors in the concentration camp system. She stayed there until the end of the war, so presumably she might have come into contact with Himmler, who used the Hohenlychen clinic as his bolt hole when things got too difficult for him in Berlin or at his army headquarters. The Red Army occupied Hohenlychen on the 1st of May 1945. Herta Oberheuser was arrested on the 8th of May 1945 and she was held in detention for nearly 2 years awaiting her trial. In part 2 I shall look at her trial as well as giving her victims a voice when they will explain what Herta Oberheuser did to them, and we'll also have a look at the long-term consequences. Thanks for listening.